Good morning, everyone. This is the Howard County Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. Thank you for joining another discussion. And today we're going to focus on CIP. And first, I will invite Mark Deluca from our DPW, and he's going to cover subjects on both Ellicott City projects and also stormwater project needs in general. So, Mark, can you try to share from your screen?
Okay. It will take me a second.
Okay, so while Mark is opening the files, today we really try to continue the discussion about capital budget infrastructure needs in general. And following Mark will be representative from our Office of Transportation Director, Bruce Gardner, and maybe some of his colleagues will make a presentation about public transportation needs and the status in general. He's also going to cover some of the update on complete streets. I know a lot of people are aware of that. Okay, great, Mark.
Okay. Well, thank you, Holly. I'm going to make a presentation. My name is Mark Deluca. I'm the Bureau Chief of Environmental Services. And our Bureau has been, in DPW, has been working on the Ellicott City flood mitigation. Today I want to just, most recently, I guess, I gave an update back in March, and I wanted to talk about the flood mitigation once again. It's a very large project that we're doing. So just as a matter of background, this is an 1850s map of Ellicott City. I throw it in just for historical perspective. It was a mill town. It was very dependent on the Patapsco River, and it was a very small hamlet at the time. However, what we know today from this map, and I hope that you can see my pointer, this is the Patapsco River, so this is east, and this is Main Street. And of course, we have 3 to 4 tributaries that find their way down to the Patapsco River. And here we have the Hudson branch, we have the Tiber branch, and we have the New Cut. These are the major ones, these 3. Now, if you look at if you can look at, if my mouse will work, but if you look at these, the blue, what I've done is I've superimposed the 100-year floodplain on the tributaries, and and then also in red I've shown the buildings. In the orange is the 500-year floodplain. So as you can see, many of the buildings along Main Street are in the floodplain, always existed in the floodplain, and that's been a big reason why we've seen so much damage. It's within the 100-year floodplain. And so when we have the large storms, which we have had in the past, these areas flood out. Now, back in July of 2016 and again in May of 2018, we received approximately 6 inches of rain in 3 hours. So we call that a high intensity, short duration storm. And we've had these kind of flood events before, going back to 1768. One of the most notable ones was in 1868, where we really, where the town was destroyed and there was a loss of life. Now, in these 2 storms, we did lose 1 life in each of these storms in 2016 and 2018. And I have a video I'd like to show you. I'm not going to play the whole thing. It's a couple minutes long, but I think it dramatizes and demonstrates just the power of the water. Demonstrates the power of the water and what the 2016 actually looked like. And as you look at it, you're looking at the first floor. In the lose perspective, the first floor is completely flooded out. This for tallies there, and then then on the Caplet, that's the very first floor of Caplets that was completely lost. Only a few minutes after the flood, and literally a few minutes, this is a photo, this is a video that just shows the amount of sediments and some of the overturned cars as a result of it. Now, the next morning, these pictures were, we snapped these pictures, and this is actually both the 2016 and the 2018 storm. We can see that in the top left-hand corner that the foundations of the storefronts were completely obliterated. And then you can see in the top right corner that is the old brew pub. And the stream actually runs underneath of this structure, then crosses underneath of Main Street to go into Lot D. And you can see that the water just took out the bottom and eroded out the lot next door. The two bottom photos are of Ellicott Mills Drive. These were from 2018. And what happened there was it was the water, there was a great deal of water. It was going over top of the road, but the real failure mechanism here was a really old pipe, a culvert that was approximately 40 years old at the time. It was a metal culvert and had just outlived its life. And the force of the water actually, the bottom rusted out of this pipe. The force of the water rolled it up. And then once we lost that pipe, it took out the rest of the road. So the cost of the damage and economic impact from the 2016 storm, now this was actually measured. And the county recovery effort was 9.4 million. We had 246 vehicles damaged. Main Street was closed for 69 days, and there were 146 buildings that were impacted. It was estimated that the economic activity impact was $42 to $67 million, and there was one loss of life. In the 2018 storm, similarly, looking at the similar efforts, the county recovery effort was actually more. It was 23 million. We had less vehicles damaged, 120. Main Street was closed for 24 days. We were much more practiced. It was only 2 years later. And so we knew exactly what we needed to do. Buildings impacted 180 buildings, and we did have an additional loss of life in that storm as well. So from the 2016 forward, we developed a flood mitigation plan, and that was further refined during this administration. Came up with these projects, and this is known as the Ellicott City Safe and Sound Plan. That some of these things are ponds at the upper reaches of the watershed, and some of them are improved conveyance like culverts and pipes and a north tunnel. Now on the right-hand top side of the screen, this is the green line delineates the watershed for Ellicott City, for the historic part of Ellicott City. And I don't really know how well you can see it on your monitors. But of course, a watershed is if a drop of water falls on the inside of that green line, it flows to either the Hudson, Tiber, or Newcut, and then flows to Patapsco River. If a drop of water falls outside of that green line, it goes to a different tributary, many of them going to the Patapsco River. And then the plan, and so all of these projects are within that watershed, and you can't see it too well, but they're actually outlined in purple where they are. That's not so important for this presentation, but the plan, the Safe and Sound Plan, ultimately, according to the modeling, for a 100-year storm, we would have less than 1 foot of flooding at the base of Main Street near Maryland Avenue, and during a 2016 event, we're looking at about 3 feet of water. That 2016 storm, you could think of it as a 1,000-year storm, but we did have 2 of them in 2 years. The 100-year storm, if you remember, that was the blue shaded area. Most of the buildings are within the blue shaded area. So only getting 1 foot of water would be great, because then we could do dry flood proofing, and even at 3 feet we could do dry flood proofing. So the other thing about this chart that I want to point out is the color coding. So last time I spoke to you back in March, all of these projects were listed as in the black, meaning that they were either concept, preliminary design, or in design, or still awaiting funding. Now we have blue projects, Quaker Mill Pond and the H7 Pond. These will go to construction late in FY21. And then we have, in the green, we have design underway for Maryland Avenue culverts, the West End improvements, North Tunnel, and Main Street renovations. We're still waiting for NC3 dry pond, T1 pond, and the H4 dry pond. These are in concept or preliminary design. So some progress, I think very, very good progress has been made. And that brings us up to funding opportunities, because these projects, as you can see, are very expensive. In fact, let me go back. This totals $131 million, $132 million, and in a very fiscal challenging time. And so it hasn't been without the help of a lot of our partners that we've been able to fund it. And we design and construct it as the funding comes in. So our funding opportunities have been FEMA. They've provided a lot of support, especially during the storm reconstruction, and in some other type of block grants opportunities that they have available. Also, there's the WIFIA, which is Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Grant, or no, that's better described as a loan, I'm sorry, that we are applying for. And I think we could probably talk about that a little bit more, but essentially we're borrowing. We would be able to borrow money through a federal program and pay back in a very long term. There's other federal sources as they present themselves with other agencies, and the state has been a very good partner for us. They've provided either bond bills or have provided grant opportunities for us. And so far, a lot of, I'd say that a great deal of the renovation money for the structures on Lower Main Street come from the state, and it's really allowed us to move forward. And of course, local contributions, which we have been making, and as best as we can. So this is and these are the challenges we have, the financial challenges we have to actually put this mitigation plan into effect. Has been the money. We can come up with concepts and refine concepts and put them into design. The designs are, while they're not inexpensive, they're not the most expensive things. These construction projects are the most. This is the last slide on Ellicott City. So if there are any questions about Ellicott City, I can take them now.
Good morning, Todd Arterburn here. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this. If we do all of the projects and we have another 2016 storm, we still have 3 feet of water at the bottom of Main Street, and we've spent $130 million to solve a $10 million cost to the county in 2016. But it hasn't solved it because there's still 3 feet.
So I think the true economic impact it should be pointed out, the cost to the county to rebuild the county infrastructure alone. So that was replacing any of the infrastructure that was damaged, like roads, sewer lines, gas lines, any of the infrastructure, sewer and water. However, the economic impact is a lot different. So we're talking about as much as, well, what was estimated in 16, I believe, was about 42 million. And probably they're the direct, that is the, I like to think of it as, well, that was the direct effect of the storm on this business community. However, there's lingering effects and loss of income that has not been recorded, that, you know, Ellicott City has not been an economic generator. So to answer the question more specifically to the technical side, I'd say that the 3 feet for a 1,000-year storm, with the physical constraints that the town of over 250 years old presents to us, quite a challenge. And we decided early on with the Corps of Engineers that 3 feet would be a good point, good design point, because at 3 feet, then the owners of the structures could dry flood-proof their buildings effectively. And then they came down, Corps of Engineers came down and did a study and used many of the buildings on Main Street as prototype buildings to tell them how they could waterproof their structures. And then we provided grants on the local level for those business owners to flood-proof their buildings.
So even if you add in the economic impact, which I think you said, an economic impact is not necessarily revenues to the county, it's overall economic impact. Even if you include that, then it's 130 million then to solve a $40 million problem. So we will have paid for basically 3 1,000-year storms if we spend 130.
The decision process. Oh. Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I think there might be other people who would be more appropriate to answer the policy decision. However,
No, I'm asking the financial decision. I agree with you on the policy side. I mean, it's decided at the policy, and I think it's a political decision. But that's my question from a financial perspective. Even if you include 100% of the economic impact number that you provided and the $9.4 million in recovery, call it 40 million, and we're going to spend $131 million, which means that we've got we could have 3 more of those, and that's not accounting for any time value of money. We could have 3 more of those that we will have paid for. So the next 3 1,000-year storms, we're basically, at that point, we're even.
Hey, Todd, this is Director, and I think probably Richard, what I want to say too, but that economic impact was for 1 year, well, basically the time duration. So if, so the idea being is you spend $130 million, you prevent that, otherwise you shut down Ellicott City for the rest of its, that's when you lose all that economic impact going forward.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say is, I did the study back then. Without something, you're never going to be able to do Ellicott City in terms of having the businesses, because they'll be unable to get flood insurance because of repeat activity. So without mitigation, nothing can really be done. And the decision was made by the county under the prior administration and continued under this to invest in building Ellicott City and keeping it back, because something has to be done in order, because they're uninsurable. And as you can see now in Ellicott City, there's still pretty high vacancy. So until something's done, will it pay for itself? That's a good question. I'm not sure, but as Darius said, it's an annual There's an annual couple, I can't remember the exact numbers. I can look them up and send them to you. There's $4 or $5 billion from Main Street service activity that has to be factored in as well. That would be cut dramatically.
It just strikes me that I know it's a political decision. I think we all recognize that, and political leaders have to be responsive to the sense that something needs to be done. But it feels to me like we're trying to force economics to support a political decision that the economics really can't get there. But I'll hold any further comment. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, I'd like to move on, and the next topic I wanted to discuss was our watershed restoration. Just a brief of what the watershed restoration is. It was established by EPA to reduce pollutants to Chesapeake Bay, and it was mandated by the state by the municipal separate storm sewer discharge permit. I see a typo there. Primarily, it's funded through the Watershed Protection and Restoration Fund and through the issuance of stormwater bonds. This is the watershed fee that we pay through our that is listed on our property tax. I'm pleased to say that the purpose of our watershed restoration program, which is called the MS4 program, is to reduce the effects of impervious surfaces and nutrient runoff into our streams and rivers and ultimately into the bay. It's a state mandated program. It costs us approximately $15 million a year. It has cost us over $15 million a year over the previous 5-year permit period. We are now in a new permit. I'm proud to say that over the last permit, we did meet the permit goals. It was another huge effort. It was a big lift for us. A lot of the other surrounding jurisdictions were not as fortunate as we were in actually meeting the goals. But getting the money together, getting the projects, the planning, and then the construction of them, and getting the credit for the construction was a very huge, by the state, was a huge effort by the county. And I'm very proud of the people that did the work. And I think that you may see some of the work happening. The stream restoration projects, some of them are in terrible shape. I know that I did show photos of some really damaged streams, and what they look like today is very stark. The difference is stark. But based on current estimates for our FY22 through FY27, we're anticipating a funding gap of $8.7 million at minimum. So we during this next permit period, we're going to run into some uncertainty as our fees and what they're paying for will slowly will lose capacity. So what does not completing? Of course, we have this funding gap, and we'll be trying to deal with that in the coming years. But what does not completing the requirements result in? And the first one that comes to mind is probably we have to enter into a consent agreement or a consent order with the state, Maryland Department of Environment. They will mandate us to require us legally to meet milestones that would be set up in this consent order, which means that we would have to divert money from someplace or have to come up with the funding in order to do that. And of course, there are always monetary penalties that they could place on us as well. Not sure exactly what they would do. We've seen what they've done with other jurisdictions, and it's not something that we want to experience. But it could result in all kinds of, unless there's a commitment made to meet the goal, that it could result in a lot of negatives. So that's it for the Watershed Fund. Now I wanted to talk about just stormwater infrastructure in general. We have a lot of stormwater infrastructure around us. People may not necessarily be aware of it. Usually people are very aware of it when it's in their community and their backyard, and the pond in the backyard's not draining the way it should be. We always get calls about that kind of stuff. However, we have an aging infrastructure. What I wanted to give you a briefing on first is just the elements and function of what a stormwater management facility is. And so if you look at the left-hand corner top, it's primarily, it consists of an embankment, and it has a riser structure and a barrel that goes underneath. And the pond area is that area to the right of, and that's, the typical pond area. And when it rains, it fills up with water. The water then drains out very slowly. It goes through the riser, and it's metered going through the riser. And as the water passes through the barrel, it maintains a certain flow out of the barrel that protects downstream from the development's runoff upstream. I have two pictures here. One of them is in a community, and the other is, this is adjacent to Route 1. And so these risers and barrels can be made out of either metal or concrete. When they were first being designed back in the 80s and 90s, they were all made out of metal, or primarily metal. And so if you look at the bottom left, you really can't see it well. I'll see if I can put my pointer near it, but this is the riser structure here. So this whole area would fill up with water. And then this riser structure, and this is made out of corrugated metal pipe, and they paint it black, so it's not as obtrusive. And what happens is that area here would fill up with water during a storm. It would be all the runoff from impervious surfaces created by this subdivision. It would be stored here, and then would pass through the riser and then through the embankment, and it's being metered so that it doesn't flood the community downstream. So as I was saying, the risers and barrels made out of metal. Now, the design life of metal we have found is about 20 to 25 years. And the design life of concrete is 75 to 100 years, if not more. Unfortunately, the minimum requirement MDE allowed back in the 80s and 90s was to make these out of metal. And then sometime in the 90s, when about mid-90s, they found out that these barrels and risers were failing. They switched over and no longer allowed metal. They only specified concrete. So the facts and figures for county, the county maintains about 1,500 stormwater management ponds. About 187 ponds have these metal components, and they're all approaching their design life. So our first ponds, I didn't show this here, but our first pond came into the system in about 1980. And a lot of ponds came into our maintenance between 1980 and 2000. Stormwater management regulations changed, and the new regulations kind of got away from these ponds and went to much smaller types of stormwater management that is done on the residential lot itself, like you may like dry wells or rain gardens, things like that. But we still have these ponds that need to be maintained. We do triennial inspections on these ponds, and we have a rating system. 1 is adequate to 4 is critical. And what I've done here on a small chart is I've just taken the ponds with metal pipes and gotten their ratings from our database. And so, as you can see, the majority of the ponds that we have out there are between 1 and 3. However, we do have 75 ponds that are rated critical. Now, assuming that, which we want to get those ponds fixed as soon as possible. Now, they also fall into high hazard, significant hazard, and low hazard. And that hazard rating is based on whether there will be if a failure will produce property damage, personal injury, things like that. And assuming that it costs approximately $1.2 million per pond for reconstruction, we typically would ask for $10 million to be appropriated each year to fix these ponds. Even with that, if we were trying to do just the rate, the ponds that are rated 4, it would take us 10 to 13 years to just clear out those ponds. And of course, then we have the other ponds are aging and with the metal pipes. And so they're adding to our critical ponds each year. So what we want to do is we want to be able to get to a position where we are doing some of our 3s at the same time we're doing our 4s, so that we're not always in a critical situation. And so I took some pictures, or actually the inspectors took some pictures. I put these pictures in the presentation to kind of show you generally what the pipes, these metal pipes, look like and the kind of damage. I want to just call your attention to the lower right hand, and unfortunately you can't see it really well, but I did want to point this out, that this is in a community. That's a wood fence, and there's a recycling bin right there, and these are single family homes. So this is right in a community, and it has a failing pipe, and you really can't see it well. It is the pipe that's right above it on the right hand side. And you can see that pipe has no bottom. It's completely rusted out. And that would be a 4. That was taken this year. That was taken this month, actually. So what happens is that when water is passing through it, it's eroding out on both sides. And the kind of failure that you can see is, you'll see sinkholes. You'll see, it could be a road shut down. It'll be like a catastrophic collapse of the pipe, and you'll see, and then the road will fail. We have an emergency road closure. We could also see, like on the downstream side of this, that it could flood out lots if it turned out to be a failure. There could be personal injury. There isn't always personal injury, but the possibility exists. So with the failures, we do have additional direct costs. And when I talk about direct costs, I'm talking about, what it costs us to repair it. There are other indirect costs to the county that are typically whatever happens to the properties and to the property owners. Also, if it's a major road, like say Route 1, I did show one on Route 1. If you took out Route 1, for example, then that road would be shut down. And so there is some cost to redirecting traffic around Route 1, a major corridor like that. So these are some of the results of the pipe failures. And these are very typical failures. And I just want to go back to even Ellicott City, that pipe that was underneath of Ellicott Mills Road that I showed where we had the massive blowout. Now, of course, that was a very intense storm, but usually the failure mechanism is that, the bottom of these pipes, they're always exposed to some water and they rust over 20 to 25 years. And that pipe failed, Ellicott Mills failed. It didn't necessarily, the bottom was still there, but with all the rushing water going through it, it actually rolled it. It rolled it up. So it tore the bottom and then it was able to roll it up. And that's what caused the failure of the road, because it let more and more water through. So this is something that we're having to deal with. It's a type of infrastructure that needs to be funded, and searching for the funds a lot of times they're not there, and it's the kind of project that gets deferred. Decisions are made to defer it because the priorities for the money go to other places. But this type of infrastructure maintenance is important. I think that's my last slide. And so if you have any questions about any of it, I'd like to hear any questions or comments that you might have.
So if anybody has questions, please just unmute yourself. Go ahead.
I have a question. It does seem like someone was quite negligent in thinking of a long-term consequence of this, where galvanized steel is known not to be that stable. So I'm kind of surprised that the engineers allowed that. I wonder if anybody got into trouble for that. I do hope so. My thinking is, can they be relined internally as a cost-saving measure?
That's a very good question. They can be relined. That's one of the methods. That's one of the methods that we have to fix these. There are some downsides to relining because relining does take away the effective diameter of the pipe. It's a hydraulic issue, but a lot of times there's enough capacity where we can reline them. In these, however, in the ponds, that's usually the first. The first thing we do is, however, when we look at them and we have damage to the embankment, we have to go in and kind of do the dental work in the embankment to fix it. So point well taken. As far as why was corrugated metal pipe used in the 80s and 90s, it was used, that was a state regulation. It was a minimum. And what happens is development goes to the minimum standards required. I'm sure there were some concrete pipes that were put in. They weren't required to be put in. And so that's just the way the regulations were read that came from the state. They corrected it as soon as they started to see all of the failures. But I don't disagree with you, knowing, and certainly in retrospect, knowing what we know now about metal pipes, why would we use them?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Mark, it's Steve Poynott. Quick question for you. You said that to change over all the, I guess, 4 rated pipes now is going to take us somewhere between 10 and 13 years at the current rate of spend that we have. But we have 1,500 pipes that we maintain, or ponds and pipes and everything like that. Do you believe that this is going to stop in 13 years, or are we just going to be in a lower mode but always have some level of maintenance on a go-forward basis for the rest of the ponds that we have that aren't in this, 4 rated? Will others become 4 rated over that time? Should the county expect $15 million a year on a go-forward basis?
So that's a good question, because I think the most critical need is for the metal pipes, and the metal pipes, we stopped using them in the 90s. And like we were saying, we looked at life cycle and the life of a metal pipe is approximately 20 to 25 years. So once all of these metal pipes are replaced, then I think that our maintenance costs, these large dollars for maintenance costs, really goes down. So we're only looking at a period of time where the maintenance is critical. The concrete pipes, like I mentioned, their design life is well above 75 to 100 years. And so that's generations, that can be generations from now where we have to address that. And you know, they possibly could be lined. So different methods will be coming out that we can maintain the concrete.
So yeah, Mark, and I understand that, but the part where you're saying here about maintain and you know, sitting on this committee for as many years as I have, unfortunately, it seems to be an issue as we kind of build them and then maybe not necessarily maintain them at the level because of other competing interests that we have as a growing county. So, I mean, should as we look at out-year models beyond that and we look at long-term run rates, should the county be looking to have a pot of money that they're always looking for maintenance on these, not maybe at the same level of the 15 million a year, but maybe it's 2 or 3, or are we going to not do anything and then be in the same position we are with the roads?
Well, I think that, I think that the critical need and the most dollars will be to replace these metal pieces, components. And that is a relatively short-term need that we have. It would, you know, it might take a decade to do. So in the out years, we need to be looking at that money. But what I was also saying is, and agreeing with you, is that our maintenance dollars will go down significantly once we address all of these metal pipes, because we won't see as much with the concrete pipes. And of course, there will be maintenance that needs to be done over the years. You know, when we get to about 20 years, a lot of times these ponds silt up, so they need to be dredged. There are some other, and so, you know, without dredging them, their capacity is not the same. So we have to reestablish their capacity, but that's not as critical of an issue for us right now. And it you know, doesn't necessarily cost the same amount of money as, and it's definitely not as immediate of a need. So there are some maintenance activities that need to continue to move forward. We do it, and we don't forget about the ponds because just so that I want to make that point, you know, we do inspect these, we're required to inspect these ponds every 3 years, and we maintain a database of the ponds and what their conditions are, and what that upcoming work for that pond has to be. So, but to answer your question very directly, I'd say that in the near term, future years, yeah, I think that the dollars need to be there for us to, well, we would like to see the dollars be there so that we could address these issues. We see that these as acute issues outside of regular maintenance, like the dredging and making sure that, you know, small things can go wrong with these ponds, but nothing of this size or this critical nature.
Very much.
Yeah. Thank you. And Steve made a really good point on that, the regular maintenance needs going forward. But even, which is really good point, but what Mark's tried to say is that even before we going there, we have an inventory of more imminent needs, which is based on 75. Is that 75, the ponds that's rated as a rating at 4, meaning critical needs? That group itself is in total, in aggregate, is about 100 million needs there, and you will try to spread it in the next decade, which is still require about 10 million a year investment just for that. And that combined with what you mentioned earlier for MS4, the state mandates, the annual total needs between MS4 needs and those ponds, even at the minimum level, combined will be like 16, 17 million a year. And recent years, we mostly rely on watershed fee to help issue bond, etc. But one thing I don't know whether Mark you get a chance to say is that after a couple of years, that source will be essentially completely depleted for the next 20 years. So then at that point, unless there's a revenue structure restructuring, otherwise there has to be all the needs will have to shift to geo bonds that will add to geo bonds, which is going to compete with a lot of other critical needs as well.
Revenue restructuring, Holly, do you mean increase the fee?
In aggregate, I would, yeah, that will be.
Thank you. I just thought it was an interesting way to say it, revenue restructuring.
Because it doesn't necessarily, it's just a fee increase. I think it's also going to analysis and kind of restructure how it was designed, I would think.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if no more, thank you so much, Mark.
Okay.
Good presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Bruce from Office of Transportation. Bruce, thank you.
Sure. Can everybody see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Bruce.
Thank you very much. Okay, check my mute button here. Well, thank you. Tough to follow on the heels of Mark and all the challenges that he has below the surfaces of our streets and different areas of the county. But I'm here today to talk to you about some of the more visible things that we do on the transportation network. This is a presentation by the Office of Transportation. I'm the current administrator of the Office of Transportation. So we have three categories that I'd like to talk through today. One being transit service and the supporting capital and operating budgets that go into that. The second is active transportation. So that's the bike and pedestrian projects and the complete streets policy that we've been implementing. And finally, talking a little bit at the end of the presentation about transportation corridors and policies that we look at in cooperation with the state and our regional partners to think about the future. So with the different types of capital projects, this slide focuses on just the highlights of the capital projects in three different areas. And I have about 20 slides in this deck. So I'll go into a little bit less word intensive slides in a few minutes to talk about each of these. But with our transit projects, you see basically two different categories of spending and capital for that. We spend about $160,000 to $170,000 annually over the past 5 years for the bus stop improvements, and I'll have some details on those. And we also purchase 3 replacement buses each year, and we try to leverage the state and federal grants that we get to get those. The need is a bit higher than that, but that's pretty much what we can count on getting from the state and matching that at about either 10 or 20%, and I'll have more details on that. The transit center that is in the CIP is something in the out years, so we don't have any expenditures projected for that before FY 2025. On the pedestrian project side, the CIP includes annual funding of about $1 million a year. So you see the 3 projects that are listed there. Those are typically programs of projects because we are talking about fairly small dollar amounts, nothing like Mark's Ellicott City discussion, but pretty key links and small investments that sometimes are intensive because of right-of-way needs. The third category of projects, the bike and shared use pathway projects, are included primarily in K5066, but they're also end up in individual T traffic or the N for rec and parks projects. These projects are often eligible for state grant funding. I've got some slides later in the presentation that identify some of these, and you see the 4 projects that are highlighted that often get categorized as our improvement projects for the bike and shared use paths. So now to focus on transit projects and services. The operating focus that we have is improving reliability and service through technology. So you'll see some things that we've been doing there with minimal dollars. I'm going to talk a little bit about transit operations during COVID and how dynamic that has been. And finally, I'll talk about the Transit Development Plan, which is a 5-year plan for expanded service. So the detail on the bus replacements is found on this slide, slide 4. What we found with the RTA fleet is that it was quickly aging out and facing reliability issues in about the 2017 to 2018 period, after the different small transit systems were consolidated into the RTA, and there were buses loaned and just kept together basically on a shoestring. So the operating budget today includes a $500,000 annual payment for 13 leased vehicles. That's a 10-year lease beginning in FY18. But the chart on this shows the progress that we've made in the last couple of years with obtaining grant money. There's been some one-time grants like the VW Air Quality Settlement that is generating 3 buses but has a 25% match. We got a discretionary grant from the FTA that provided 3 buses and a bus stop announcement system. So bottom line is the county share in the past 2 years has been relatively high, but it's leveraged quite a bit of fleet replacement that was really, we had a backlog, so this has been helpful. Moving forward, we would expect to need about $250,000 annually to match the MTA funding under the current policies. So they, because of their own revenue situation with the state, have reduced their share of the grant. So if we get a federal grant, we're responsible for 20%, as opposed to back in FY20, we were only coming up with 10% for those buses. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about bus stop improvements. We have 493 bus stops in Howard County. Only 63 of those have shelters. The improvements that we've made over the past year have been relatively minor improvements, but very important ones, because these are the connections. They're both ADA landing pads, they're sidewalk and curb ramp connections. So really, making sure our system, if we're running buses, has accessibility for not just people with disabilities, but anyone who wants to conveniently ride the system. The shelters that we put in place, I see a picture there in the bottom right. Those were, we put several in at the Columbia Mall, so there's solar lighting on those, but they are relatively expensive at $12,000 per unit. So we aren't in a position right now to put shelters at many stops on an annual basis. Moving forward, the CIP includes approximately $40,000 per year beginning in FY23. So you can see both our spending and as we look at the need and trying to roll out improvements, the small level improvements of $6,000 to $8,000, our need is about $175,000 annually to keep a good pace of those improvements. On the topic of improvements and what we can do without large capital dollars, and what we have been doing in the last year, is focused on technology. So we have implemented in the fall of 2020 real-time bus arrival information, and we have put this out so that it is an open source, and basically you can go to a Google Maps or a transit app. We've gotten into a partnership with the transit app, so you might have seen ads on the buses recently. And you can basically, pull that app up and see when a bus is going to come to a stop near you. It'll direct you. So that really helps the awareness of the customer. Mobile ticketing is something we'd like to move to very shortly in 2021, and this provides an option for paying transit fare kind of at the time you're making a decision, rather than thinking about, do I have cash to get on the bus? So those people with the mobile phones, the mini computers in your pocket, it's very simple, but we're also trying to make sure that any system that we allow will allow to buy for others or online, and also allow for fare capping, which is essentially a policy that ensures that you're not overpaying for transit. When you only have money to buy a single ticket, that adds up. So this would say if you buy a lot of single tickets, you wouldn't pay any more than an amount for a pass. Coming in the future, we have the bus stop announcement system that will hit on the buses. Right now, we rely on drivers to do that. That's hit and miss proposition, and with masks and plexiglass barriers in the buses, that makes it even more challenging for both the disability community and others who want to know when their stop is coming to to be aware of where they are in the system. So speaking of plexiglass barriers and masks, this is a slide that talks about some of the more recent changes that we've had to the RTA operations and some of the challenges. At the top there, you see that we reduced our service down to 45% of our service levels, cutting back hours and cutting back on the headway of the service. In March, with the beginning of the pandemic, we ramped up in June to about 65% of our service levels, and we basically stayed at that level throughout that period without a lot of ridership. We've been providing for free fares. That's mainly to keep the drivers safe and passengers safe, so that there's not that interaction at the front of the bus. So rear boarding, we have been have signs to remind people about social distancing on the vehicles, requiring masks, and then trying to limit capacity. We have not seen problems with that capacity limit, unlike some transit systems. So we haven't had to add extra buses where we have overcrowding. So crossing our fingers, that has been going okay. The ridership is at 35% of our normal levels, so that will continue to be a drain. We are reinstating fares on January 2nd, and we expect that ridership might drop slightly for that. But you know, when you talk about fares, that's a loss of about $1 million this year when we haven't been charging for fares. And in this year, as I referenced before about state funding, the state has cut back the grants that we receive by 20%. So that's about $900,000 a year for the foreseeable future. That depends on MDOT and Transportation Trust Fund revenue streams as to when that might come back. Fortunately, CARES Act funding from FTA has filled the void in the near term, and we think we can have that supporting those losses of revenues through FY23. We have that amount of time to spend that, if not more. And as many of you know that are watching the news out of DC, transit is one of the state and local aid discussions that they're still having with the $900 billion stimulus bill. So moving on, what would back to normal be? So we had a transit development plan that envisioned expansion of the RTA routes. Over 5 years, every system in the state is required to do this planning effort and look at our most logical extensions to expand service. So we did phase 1 of that in May of 2019, where we expanded our hours and increased frequency, more weekend service, since a lot of the jobs on Saturdays and Sundays for those transit dependent don't go away on the weekends. And what you see on this slide 8 is the different routes that were considered in the TDP. If we were to implement all of them, the annual operating impact is about $4.5 million, and that doesn't include the new buses that we would need to purchase. And those larger RTA buses are about $415,000 a piece, as you'll see in a moment. So shifting to our active transportation projects, the pedestrian projects that we have are guided by the Walk Howard plan. They've been ongoing and investing in that area for years, but just this past year, the council adopted our pedestrian master plan. And this highlight on one of the pages of the plan just shows that if we were to address 15% of the needs identified in that Walk Howard plan and wanted to address that 15% over the next 5 years, we'd be spending about $2.6 million per year on those sidewalk and crosswalk and some traffic signal improvements. The average funding that we see in the CIP is just over $1 million a year. So the current year and in FY22, what we're expecting, we have a good infusion, and we've had some projects on the books that we're getting close to completing in partnership with DPW, who does the lion's share of the work on the construction and the difficult process of right-of-way acquisition. So that chart just shows you what is in the Walk Howard plan. The Bike Howard plan has been around a bit longer. There's been, you've heard of Bike Howard Express, and so implementing some of these projects that are pathways, shared use pathways to a large extent. And the timeframes of those a little bit differently structured than the Walk Howard plan, but The chart on the right there just talks a bit about short, medium, and long-term improvements. Not going to go over that right here, but what I will say is that our current CIP, we have about 1.5 million that was projected in FY22 last year. So we've been targeting those for a lot of the ongoing projects I'll go to in the next couple slides. But real story on some of the shared use paths, and we're talking about things along Dobbin Road, in particular Robert Fulton Drive. We got money for a North Laurel connection, so just to put some names to some of these. But these programs, projects are can be competitive for state grant programs. There's only a 20% match required, but we found that 45% match really helps your success rate in those for these projects that are in the $1 to actually more than $3 million, what we're seeing. So what we've tried to structure is the projects that we have in design, the 4 or 5 projects that we have in design. If we go after a grant for one of those over the next several years and are successful, we have enough money in the CIP to complete those. If we are not successful in getting the state grants, then we start having to make decisions about projects that we've been designing and put on hold. And then we'd be looking at the Bike Howard plan for improvements in the future. Sorry about that. I just scrolled a little too fast. So moving on to this listing. This is a lot of detail, as Holly has told me twice as I was showing you this, but we presented this at the Transportation Town Hall. For those of you who attended that, or you could find this on our Office of Transportation webpage. It gives a snapshot of where we are in the moment in terms of each one of about 30-some projects. So this first page, and the top page, you see construction starts in April 21. So pretty certain that those are moving forward. We're getting into the final steps of those, and they're funded. So that's the story on the first page. The second page, as you get through into FY22 and 23, some key things to point out here. So the US 1 projects in the middle of that page, I'll talk about in a minute, but obviously that's a state facility, and we were looking to the state to get construction funding for those. So that'll be dependent on decisions at MDOT and what we can press in terms of our priorities to them. At the bottom of the page, you see the paving of the Patuxent Branch Trail. It has it's increased in cost. We got a grant for the design, and we thought a fair amount of the construction, but it turns out we'll have to go to another grant for the construction of that. Dobbin Road, South Entrance Trail, Robert Fulton Pathway those are the projects that I was referring to a minute ago about being ones that are being competitive for grant funding, and that we will continue to look to the state to help with those. And make the point that those small projects at the state can go a long way if they were to increase their funding for these types of projects. So I wanted to shift from projects to policy. We were last October, more than a year ago, we presented a policy and legislation to the County Council, and they adopted a Complete Streets program in Howard County. So that really means when we're designing our street system and looking at projects, that we're thinking about all users of the transportation system. This picture just shows all the elements to the projects that we'll be considering. There's a few key phrases that we keep in mind as we're implementing Complete Streets, and that's safety. And really, there's a lot of system preservation. Mark talked a lot about system preservation in his discussion, and we need to focus on the system preservation to ensure safe streets as well. Coordinating with DPW, State Highway to get the grants and to talk through how the system connects is important. Very important is the equity consideration. So a lot of the need for the transit dependent population, those without vehicles, is for these sidewalk connections and not relying on the roadway. So we really want to make sure we focus our efforts in these areas where vulnerable populations exist, and get input from areas of the county that we may not have seen talking about these projects before. some of the accomplishments that we've had in the past year are notable as we've developed a transportation improvement priority process. So as funding moves forward and we're able to add things to the capital program, we're taking a look at how the projects score from a connectivity basis, from safety, equity, and that should help guide our decisions moving forward, in addition to just the transportation and system preservation decisions that need to be made. Holly, the next couple are talking about some of the SHA corridors, so I can pause here because there was a lot of information. I probably should have stopped at transit previously, but I'd like to go ahead and stop for questions on some of those county projects and policies that I've already discussed. I can keep moving forward if.
Yeah, Bruce, looks like you already addressed people's potential questions, so keep moving.
I will do.
Thank you.
Okay. Another key responsibility of our office is to look at regional and state partnerships with respect to the transportation system. Just some highlights that I'll go through on the next few slides, including our corridor studies, safety improvements, and some of the state transit decisions. I saw J.C. Hendrickson's is on the committee, so he's familiar with a lot of the MARC discussions, but going first to these strategic highway corridor studies. We looked at Maryland 99 about a year ago, came out with a report that identified a variety of little hotspots and recommendations for spot improvements along that corridor. For those of you that know the county, you know that is in a normal school year with the school system. There's a lot of school hour arrival and dismissal congestion along that corridor. And when the rush hour hits on I-70 and there's an incident, it can really flare. So this study was a way of identifying a lot of improvements that could be made by either the county or the state to improve that corridor. So we're doing similar level of effort on 103, 104, and 108 as a system through the heart of the upper county there. And then we've also looked at US 1 over the past several years as a key corridor within the county, with some pedestrian components to that for sure. And this chart really shows the activity that we've taken in the past few years to design 5 projects. We still need about $300,000 to finish the design. That'll be we're going to be requesting in the upcoming year for, I believe it's the Dr. Patel Drive and another one of these intersections. But the goal is to get these designed and eligible for either federal stimulus money, if that ever comes, or the state funding. The state does focus. Greg Slater, as a longtime highway administrator, is focused on safety so this could speak to their priorities, but their funding situation has not allowed for this. But we're getting ready for that big ask to make these improvements. Another level of decision making that impacts our transportation system is the commuter bus, MARC trips, and the express bus service that is not operated by the county but serves the county. So this slide we did back in September when the state announced their transit reductions. These reductions they're still in place. They are labeled as kind of deferments or suspension of service, but really without an improved revenue outlook for the state, we're not sure when these will come back. But obviously first demand has to come back. The state is not seeing high demand levels on these commuter type routes. So we would like to see particularly the 150 express bus service come back, because that offers connections into downtown that don't exist anywhere else, and really help pull us into that region. I mentioned before the Federal CARES Act funding helps replace state reductions for the services that we do operate within the county. One bigger picture item that I'll end on in these last 3 slides is the discussion that the region and the state legislators from the Baltimore region have been having about transit governance and funding. So Among the big transit systems in the nation, the Baltimore system is one of the very few that is run by the state and not by a regional entity. Now that means the locals are not putting a lot into that MTA system, but in the case of Howard County, we aren't getting a lot of service out of that MTA system. We do get connected to a good network, but what this governance and funding study will look at is a few things that are listed on this next slide. Just a history of some of the funding and providing financial information, looking at peer agencies to see if it would be beneficial to come up with a different model for the Baltimore region. The Washington Metro system has a lot of coordination and a lot of local input, but when big decisions are made in the Baltimore region, the local elected officials often don't get a say. They kind of have to react to major decisions that are made by the state. So without citing any specific projects, I'll leave it at that. But the study will take place between now and July, with a report coming out in July of 21 for consideration by county elected and state elected officials. So that concludes my presentation. A lot to go through. Apologize if I spoke too quickly at points, but I'm happy to review anything that was in those slides, and I'm assuming the committee gets the slide deck for future reference. So I'm available for questions by email at any point in the future if anyone wants to follow up and doesn't want to ask it now.
So any questions for Bruce? Okay. Without that, thank you so much, Bruce, and also thank you for Mark for the presentations today. I also want to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers this year, because this will be the last meeting in this calendar year. And last a few weeks, with the past few CIP sessions, I would say for the first time, it allows the committee to have kind of a deep dive to understand different aspects of the CIP needs of the county. It's provide really good information, pretty comprehensive. So as we can tell that there are a lot of needs on the fundamental infrastructure of this county. A large portion is really attributable to the cumulative needs in the past decades that's not always get addressed promptly, maybe due to the funding constraints there. So we do have a lot of challenges ahead of us. We also have to balance that needs with the revenue capacity, which reflects the tax burden today. So we do have a lot of things to think about that and digest, but I want to thank everybody for participating and continue that discussion. Our next meeting will be currently planned for January 7th. We're still working on the agenda because originally the plan was for a business panel discussion, but EDA is extremely overwhelmed at this point, as you are now trying to provide different assistance to impacted business during this pandemic, and we're not able to do that. So we're still talking with other speakers to see whether we can move them to January 7th. So we will provide you more information, obviously, in advance. But before that, I also want to wish everybody very happy holidays. Thank you all very much. I'll see you in the new year.
Thank you, Holly. See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a happy holiday.
And stay safe, everyone.